Hercule Poirot is called to a quiet English estate where a centuries-old oak bench hides more than woodwork. Beneath its carvings lies a hidden compartment holding a clue to a long-buried crime. As secrets of inheritance, betrayal, and murder surface, Poirot must untangle the past before it claims another victim. Chapter 1. The bench on the terrace. The summer air shimmered with heat. Over the grounds of Marchand Hall, a vast Edwardian estate nestled in the rolling hills of Surrey, the ivy-clad mansion sat in dignified repose beneath an endless blue sky, its polished windows glittering like facets of a gem. A terrace of weathered stone unfurled from the drawing room, flanked by manicured topiary and overflowing urns of geraniums. Here, among the blooms and the murmurs of distant bees, stood the carved oak bench. It was a curious piece, heavy and time-worn. Its backrest was intricately adorned with whorls of vine leaves, fluted columns, and most unusually 3 small figures that appeared to be monks, each with a subtly different expression, solemn, amused, and mournful. The bench was said to be centuries old, brought back from a monastery in Belgium by the late Sir Roland Marchand, patriarch of the family and eccentric antiquarian. Local legend claimed a hidden compartment was carved into it. Nonsense, surely, but it had always lent an air of mystery to the otherwise placid terrace. On this particular afternoon, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long golden shadows over the grounds. Inside the house, the guests of Lady Eugenia Marchand were taking their tea in the cool of the drawing room. The occasion was a curious mix of formal and intimate, a weekend gathering, under the guise of charity planning, but with undertones of unspoken tensions. There was Dr. Felix Bouchard, the neuropsychiatrist from Lausanne, whose clipped accent and cool blue eyes gave him the appearance of someone who saw too much. Across from him sat Lady Marchand's niece, the vivacious and sharp-tongued Miss Imogen Vale, perpetually bored, perpetually observing. The family solicitor, Mr. Leslie Turn, hovered near the drinks tray, clutching a tumbler of whiskey with a nervous sort of reverence. Close to him was the scholarly and soft-spoken Reverend Hugh Collis, who kept dabbing at his brow with a handkerchief and glancing out toward the terrace. And then, of course, there was the hostess herself, Lady Eugenia Marchand, regal, severe, and dressed in a high-necked gown of dove gray. She presided over the tea like a queen at a tribunal. "He was late again, you know," she said abruptly, her thin fingers closing over her teacup. "Benedict, always late, and always making excuses." There was a pause as the others digested this. The he in question was her only son, Benedict Marchand, artist, drifter, and perennial disappointment. "Surely he'll arrive before supper," murmured Reverend Collis. "The train from London was delayed by engineering works, I believe." Lady Eugenia gave a withering sniff. "Trains do not excuse character, and Benedict has always lacked character," as if summoned by her disdain. The drawing-room doors swung open, and in sauntered the man himself, Benedict Marchand, tall and lean, with a mop of chestnut curls and a cravat that looked as though it had been tied in haste. Probably because it had. He looked around at the assembled guests with the half-apologetic, half-defiant air of a man used to disappointing people. "My apologies," he said, in a tone that was both sincere and not. "The southbound line is a cruel mistress. You look like you've been drinking," Lady Eugenia said. Unmoved, I was, on the train, with a Hungarian poet. It seemed the civilized thing to do. Miss Vale let out a sudden laugh and raised her glass in mock salute. Mr. Turn coughed into his whiskey. Dr. Bouchard arched a brow but said nothing. It was only a few minutes later, after a fresh pot of tea had been brought, and the conversation had turned to the subject of Lady Eugenia's charitable trust, that the scream came, sharp, piercing, from outside. Everyone froze. The second scream shattered the stillness, this one more guttural, panicked. Benedict was the first to move. He dashed to the French doors that opened onto the terrace. The others followed, some reluctantly, some with morbid curiosity. As they spilled out into the sunlight, there, slumped beside the carved oak bench, was a man crumpled, one hand clutching his chest, the other reaching toward the grass. A silver cufflink glinted beside his outstretched arm. It was George Edivane, financier and close associate of the late Sir Roland, one of the guests who had opted for a solitary stroll rather than join the afternoon tea. A crimson stain had already begun to bloom across the breast of his cream-colored linen suit. Dr. Bouchard dropped to one knee, pressing two fingers to the man's neck. The others looked on, stunned, as the psychiatrist raised his eyes slowly. "Dead," he said quietly, "and not from natural causes." Lady Eugenia's face had gone ashen. "Murder," she whispered. But it was Imogen Vale who spoke next, voice trembling but clear. "Look, the bench, the carving. It's been tampered with." All heads turned to the carved oak bench. The figure of the amused monk, once smiling benignly now, had a jagged, splintered hole beneath his robe. A hidden compartment had indeed been opened, and whatever it once held was gone. Far off in the distance, the sound of an approaching motor car hummed over the rise, and in the back seat, adjusting his cuffs and preparing to meet a new mystery, sat a small, meticulously dressed Belgian man with an upturned mustache and a glint in his eye. "Murder," murmured Hercule Poirot, "is never convenient, but it is always revealing." Nest's pause. Chapter 2. The first close stillness that followed George Edivane's death was uncanny. Not a bird sang in the hedges. The breeze that had earlier whispered through the beeches seemed to pause in reverence or fear. Poirot stepped onto the terrace precisely 7 minutes after the body was discovered, having arrived in a hired Daimler, summoned earlier that morning by a terse and oddly worded telegram, signed only with the initials I.V. Now, he surveyed the scene with the measured calm of a man who had seen too many corpses and too many lies. The body had not been moved. It lay a few feet from the carved oak bench, the head at an unnatural angle, the eyes frozen in a glassy stare toward the sky. Poirot's gaze lingered on the cufflink, the silver one glinting on the grass, just inches from Edivane's fingers. He bent, delicately picked it up with his handkerchief, and examined it. The initial GE was engraved with faintly theatrical flourishes. "Odd," he murmured. "One does not lose a cufflink after death." It was placed, perhaps, or pulled loose during a struggle. Behind him, the household was gathered. Lady Eugenia stood with fists clenched, her steel composure threatening to fracture. Imogen Vale had gone pale, though her eyes remained sharp, focused. Benedict leaned against a column, arms crossed, face unreadable. Mr. Turn hovered near the doorway, lips pressed tight, while Reverend Collis clutched a prayer book to his chest. Though he did not seem to be praying, only Dr. Bouchard maintained any clinical calm, and he stepped forward now, clearing his throat. "I checked for signs of life immediately. There were none. I'd estimate death occurred within the last 20 minutes. There is a wound chest, left side. A blade, I think, though it could have been obscured." Poirot gave a short nod, then turned his attention to the bench. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the carving. "No one's touched it," Imogen said quickly. "Not since we saw that." She pointed toward the small, hollowed opening beneath the figure of the smiling monk. A jagged piece of dark wood jutted from the gap, freshly broken. Inside, there was nothing. Poirot crouched beside the bench and peered inside. His fingers, encased in spotless gloves, traced the edges of the compartment. "It was not meant to be opened by force," he said. "See here, the hinge marks are delicate. Old, yes, but intact until very recently. Someone knew it was here, and they came prepared to open it hurriedly, perhaps clumsily, but with intent." Lady Eugenia's voice was cold as polished marble. That bench has been here for over 40 years. No one ever said a word about hidden compartments. And now suddenly George Edivane lies dead beside it. And you suggest he was murdered for what was inside. Poirot stood slowly. I suggest nothing yet, madam. I observe. I deduce. And what do you deduce now? Asked Benedict, folding his arms tighter across his chest. Poirot gave him a glance. That this murder was not impulsive, and that the secret in the carved oak bench, whatever it was, is central to the motive. Could it have been robbery? Reverend Collis ventured. If there was something of value hidden, papers, jewels, even money. Poirot held up a hand. Perhaps. But why kill Mr. Edivane? Why not wait until the terrace was empty? He may have interrupted the thief, Mr. Turn said in a hoarse voice. George was always taking solitary walks. He likely stumbled upon the act and was silenced. "Non," said Poirot, softly but firmly. "That does not satisfy. A thief who is interrupted does not take the time to open a concealed compartment and extract its contents. No, whoever did this came knowing the bench contained something. The murder was not a consequence, it was the objective." A silence followed. Poirot's words hung in the warm air like a chill. Imogen cleared her throat. "George was one of my uncle's closest friends. Sir Rowland trusted him more than almost anyone. Except, perhaps, Mr. Turn." The solicitor flinched. I hardly knew Mr. Edivane socially. Our dealings were professional." Poirot gave a slight incline of the head. "All relationships are of interest to me, social, professional, secret. I will ask each of you to remain within the house for now. I will begin my inquiries at once." Dr. Bouchard stepped forward again. "Should we not call the authorities?" "Scotland Yard?" Poirot's mustache twitched. "The Yard will be notified. But I ask for a brief delay. If you will indulge me sometimes, before the machinery of officialdom descends. The truth is more visible in the quiet moments." Poirot's eyes swept once more over the terrace, the fallen body, the bench with its fractured secret, the gathering of strained faces and massed emotions. He took a step back. "Now, I will examine the victim's room. Someone, I think, may have planted the seeds of this crime before the body fell." As he turned to enter the house, Lady Eugenia called after him. "Monsieur Poirot, you said the murderer came with intent. Then I must ask, do you believe that the intended victim was George?" Poirot did not turn. "That, madam, remains to be seen," and with that, he vanished into the shadowed halls of Marchand Hall, where secrets like dust tend to gather undisturbed. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. Drawing room of Marchand Hall had been transformed, as if by an invisible curtain, from a space of idle tea-chatter into a chamber of tension and wary glances. Poirot, after a preliminary inspection of George Edivane's room, tidy, almost obsessively so, requested that the household reconvene. The French windows had been thrown open to air out the scent of tragedy that still lingered on the terrace beyond. The suspects, though no one dared yet call them that, filed in one by one, and Poirot took a seat by the fireplace, hands neatly folded on his lap. A low table had been cleared to make space for a small notebook, a silver pencil, and an untouched cup of black coffee. Lady Eugenia stood stiffly near the mantelpiece, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Benedict lounged in a faded armchair by the bookcase, one leg swinging idly. Imogen Vale took a corner seat on the sofa, legs crossed, her keen eyes missing nothing. Reverend Collis and Dr. Bouchard sat opposite each other, their mutual discomfort silently palpable. Mr. Turn, pale and fidgeting, remained standing near the door. As though hoping for a sudden escape, Poirot cleared his throat. "Let us begin, Ms. Amos, with something simple. I must understand the nature of this gathering. What precisely brought you all together here at Marchand Hall?" Lady Eugenia spoke first, voice clipped. "This was to be a planning retreat. My late husband established the Marchand Charitable Endowment. For the preservation of European art his passion, you understand. Since his death, I've chaired it. George Edivane was our treasurer, Mr. Turn, our legal advisor, Imogen and Benedict, our board members. The Reverend Collis is our liaison with the ecclesiastical societies we fund. Dr. Bouchard was here, unofficially. At that, several pairs of eyes turned to the psychiatrist. Dr. Bouchard inclined his head slightly. I was invited by Lady Marchand. Yes, we've consulted before on matters of cognitive decline, especially in cases involving legacy planning. I assumed it was professional. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And was it? The doctor paused. In part, Imogen gave a faint, dry chuckle. That's a lovely way to phrase it. Poirot turned his attention to her. And you, mademoiselle? What was your role in the trust? She gave a little shrug, examining her fingernails. I lend my name, mostly. Attend the Odd Gala. Look decorative at committee meetings. And Monsieur Benedict. I paint, he said flatly, and pretend to care about tax-deductible art programs. Lady Eugenia gave him a hard look, but said nothing. Poirot made a note, then looked up. Was Monsieur Edivane well liked? That question settled like a stone among the group. Reverend Collis shifted. He was admired, respected, but not loved. Silence. Poirot allowed the moment to stretch before filling it himself. Respect and admiration, they are public things. But affection, that is private. Who among you would say they were truly close to Monsieur Edivane? Imogen answered, almost reluctantly. He and my uncle were inseparable. Once. George knew all his dealings, especially the ones people didn't speak about. What sort of dealings? Lady Eugenia's voice cracked like a whip. Old gossip, half-truths. Roland was a collector. He dealt in antiquities. Not all of them came with pristine provenance. That was a long time ago. And yet, Poirot said quietly, some secrets they endure. Even in wood. He turned back to his notebook. Now, the bench. This item, was it ever discussed by Sir Roland? Lady Eugenia stiffened. It was his favorite piece. He had it brought from the continent Belgium, I think years before I married him. He always kept it on the terrace, even when it cracked in the frost. Poirot's mustache twitched. And was there ever any mention of its unusual construction? Once, Benedict said slowly. When I was a boy, I remember Father polishing it himself. I asked him why. He said it contained something very old. Something important. Lady Eugenia turned sharply toward him. I never heard that story. You weren't in the room, Benedict said simply. Not everything happened where you could see it, Mother. Poirot tapped the silver pencil thoughtfully against the spine of his notebook. It seems, then, that at least one person in this house knew of the compartment. And if Monsieur Edivane was killed to conceal or obtain what was hidden, then we must ask, what was inside? Silence again. Poirot stood. It is evident that this crime was not merely one of violence, but of strategy. Whoever took the contents of that bench knew exactly what they were after, which means that one of you, Ms. Amos, knew of the secret beforehand. You're saying one of us is the killer. Mr. Turn's voice cracked. I am saying that the truth is within this room, Poirot said calmly. As always, it is merely a matter of looking closely enough. He walked slowly toward the door, pausing just before exiting. I shall speak with each of you in turn. For now, I ask you only to think not of what you have seen, but of what you have not seen. What was missing? What changed? Then, with a small bow, he departed. Behind him, 6 suspects sat in silence, each with something to hide. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives, though he had technically already arrived, sweeping in just moments. After the discovery of the body, it was only now, with the household subdued and watched, that Hercule Poirot truly arrived. For it was one thing to step onto a terrace amid gasps and accusations. It was quite another to methodically step into a mystery and make it his. He began, as he always did. Not with assumptions, but with the environment. Ah, mais oui, he murmured to himself, hands clasped neatly behind his back as he walked the perimeter of the carved oak bench. For the third time, the afternoon sun was now dipping lower, turning the terrace gold. George Edivane's body had been respectfully removed by the local constable, though not without Poirot's stern supervision and detailed measurements of its placement. Nothing had been touched without being photographed, sketched, and recorded. He had even measured the angle of the shadow falling from the bench. At the estimated time of death, people lie, he had once told Hastings, but geometry does not. Now alone at last, Poirot turned his attention to the carving once more. He touched the splintered opening with the tip of his gloved finger. The wood was fresh in breakage, torn hastily, yet the compartment it had revealed was too shallow to house anything bulky or heavy. A folded paper, perhaps, a key or a photograph. Inside, he found a thin trace of dust lining the bottom of the hollow. No fingerprints, he had checked that earlier, but wedged in the corner, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was a single coarse hair, blonde. Coarser than Imogen's, not Lady Eugenia's. Benedict. Possibly Dr. Bouchard? Less likely. He bagged it carefully, then stood and adjusted his cuffs. A few steps led him to the balustrade, where he paused and surveyed the grounds below. From here, the gardens rolled out like a perfectly kept map, no place for anyone to hide easily. Behind him, the French doors opened with a gentle creak. "Ah," said Poirot without turning. "You have come to observe, mademoiselle?" Imogen Vale stepped lightly onto the terrace, a cigarette already lit. "Observe? No, eavesdrop, perhaps. But you already knew that." Poirot smiled faintly. "I thought it more likely you had come, because you are restless. You are the sort who cannot abide unanswered questions." She leaned against the balustrade beside him, exhaling smoke. "What gave me away? Your eyes. They are always scanning. They drink too much to belong to someone who claims to be bored." There was a brief silence, filled by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of bees. "I don't think it was random," she said suddenly. "George's murder, neither do I," Poirot replied. "He was hiding something. I think he was afraid. 2 nights ago, I came downstairs to get a book. He was in the library with Mr. Turn. They were arguing. Whispers, but sharp. I caught one word, testament." Poirot turned to her. "A will." "I assume so. My uncle had many." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Many wills." Roland was capricious and vindictive. He changed his mind often, usually to punish someone. I've been both beneficiary and disinherited 3 times over. Was George Edivane involved in the latest version? "I don't know," she said, tossing the cigarette end into the flower bed. "But I wouldn't be surprised if what was hidden in that bench was part of it." Poirot tapped his finger thoughtfully against his chin. "You are very forthcoming, mademoiselle." She tilted her head. "Do you think I killed him?" "I think," Poirot said, "that you observe things others miss, and that makes you both useful and dangerous." She laughed softly and turned to leave. "Be careful, Poirot. This house is full of people who hide better than they show." When she was gone, Poirot allowed himself a sigh. Inside the drawing room, the others remained silent, each caught in the quicksand of their own thoughts. Poirot re-entered and stood by the fireplace once more, but this time his presence carried a different weight. The air shifted. "My friends," he said gently, "I have now taken my first steps across the stage you have laid out for me. I see the scenery, the actors, the props. Soon the plot will begin to unfold." Mr. Turn blinked. "Are we actors in your play, Monsieur Poirot?" "Mais non," Poirot said. "You have written your own roles. I am merely the one who reads between the lines." He paused, then added, "I shall begin interviews this evening, in the library, one by one. But for now, I leave you with a question." They all looked up. Why was George Edivane alone on the terrace at that precise time, next to a bench that no one had touched in 40 years? Reverend Collis swallowed. You think he went there deliberately? Poirot gave a faint nod. I think he was lured, and then he turned and walked from the room, leaving the question echoing in the still air. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The library at Marchand Hall was a room of shadows and quiet authority. Rows of tall bookcases, lined with leather-bound volumes, rose to a ceiling coffered in dark oak. A globe, slightly dusty, stood by the hearth. Heavy drapes filtered the fading light into golden shafts. It was a room made for secrets, and Poirot, ever appreciative of symmetry in setting and sentiment, selected it for his interviews. He sat in a high-backed chair beside a writing desk, his silver pencil and notebook arranged with ritual precision. A tray of chamomile tea had been brought at his request. He believed nervous. Tongues often loosened with warmth. The first to be summoned was Mr. Leslie Turndot, the solicitor, entered with the twitchy caution of a man expecting reprimand. His thin face, framed by gold-rimmed spectacles, looked paler than it had in the drawing room. Please, monsieur, Poirot said with gentle formality, gesturing to the chair opposite. Sit. This is not an interrogation. It is merely a conversation. Turn sat. His hands fidgeted in his lap until Poirot offered him tea. He declined, his eyes fixed on Poirot's hands instead, as though the detective's stillness unnerved him. I understand you were Sir Rowland's solicitor for many years. 23, to be exact. I handled all his legal matters, property, endowments, personal trusts, and the will. Turn cleared his throat. Several. Sir Rowland updated his will frequently. The final version was signed 6 months before his death, and I believe it stands uncontested. Poirot tilted his head. Yet you and Monsieur Edivane were overheard arguing about a testament. Why? Turn stiffened. I wouldn't call it an argument. We disagreed on interpretation. There was a clause George wished to revisit. Poirot's gaze sharpened. A clause that involved the bench. A pause. Then, evasively, he suspected there were documents never formally entered into the legal record. George was obsessed with the notion that Rowland hid things, contracts, even letters in that bench. Was he correct? I have no idea. I never saw him produce anything. If something was there, he took it to the grave. Poirot leaned back. Merci, Monsieur Turn. I may call upon you again. Turn rose quickly, bowed stiffly, and left with the gait of a man holding in more than he had released. A moment later, Dr. Felix Bouchard entered, his calm and stark contrast to his predecessor's nervous energy. Your setting, Monsieur Poirot, is appropriately theatrical, he remarked, settling into the chair. You find murder theatrical, Doctor? Not murder, but the human reactions to it very much so. Poirot gave a faint smile. You are a man of psychology. Then tell me, how did George Edivane strike you? Cerebral, somewhat rigid. He viewed emotion as weakness, though I suspect he felt it deeply. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd experienced some kind of emotional repression early in life. Poirot nodded slowly. You say this as a man who has studied him, as a man who has watched him. There's a difference. Observation is passive, but often more telling. And did you observe him yesterday, before he was found dead? Yes. He took to walks during the day, once in the morning, again late afternoon. The second time, he carried something in his jacket pocket, a square bulge, paper, perhaps, or a small box. Poirot leaned forward. You saw him on the terrace? No, from the upper corridor window. He crossed the rose path toward the house. You did not follow? I am not in the habit of chasing men in gardens, Monsieur Poirot. There was a flash of something beneath the surface. Contempt, perhaps. Poirot registered it, filed it away, and offered a crisp nod. Thank you, Doctor. The third interview brought Reverend Hugh Collis. who entered clutching his prayer book like a shield. He lowered himself slowly, folding his hands. "Reverend," Poirot said gently, "your relationship to the family was spiritual, yes, but also, I believe, personal. I was Roland's confessor. When he chose to be devout, which was not often, his faith was convenient when it soothed his guilt. Guilt over what?" Collis hesitated. He never confessed particulars, but he feared legacy more than damnation. That's why he created the endowment, to be remembered as a benefactor. Poirot tapped his fingers together. "And you, what is your role in this weekend's gathering?" "I'm merely a liaison. I advise the board when art and ecclesiastical values intersect. Nothing more." "And George Edivane, did he believe in legacy?" The Reverend's lips thinned. "George believed in control. Legacy was just another means of securing it." Poirot was silent for a moment, then asked, "Was he afraid in recent days?" Collis looked surprised. Yes, now that you mention it." He seemed unusually tense, like a man waiting for a letter that hadn't arrived. "Merci, Reverend. That will be all for now." As Collis exited, Poirot closed his notebook and sighed. 3 interviews, and already the strands began to form: control, secrets, fear, and the shadow of Roland Marchand, long dead, yet still casting influence over the living. Outside, dusk had fallen, and the moon began to rise above the treetops. And within the walls of Marchand Hall, 6 lives intersected, 5 of them suspect. Chapter 6. The first false lead. Next morning dawned pale and gray, the sky veiled with low clouds that dulled the world into quiet tones of slate and silver. Marchand Hall, usually majestic in the early light, looked somber now, its gables and turrets casting sharp shadows against the gravel drive. The carved oak bench on the terrace had been cordoned off with Poirot's direction, and none of the household dared approach it. Poirot rose precisely at 6:30, completed his morning ablutions with the care of a man preparing for the theater, and descended to the breakfast room where only Imogen Vale sat, spooning fruit onto her plate with languid disinterest. "No one else is up," she murmured, not looking at him. "Or perhaps they're avoiding you." "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said, taking his seat. "But I am quite used to avoidance. Guilt often walks softly while innocence runs to meet me." She glanced at him, amused. "And which do you think I'm doing, walking or running?" "Observing," he replied, which is always the more dangerous habit. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded briskly in the corridor, and Mr. Leslie Turn burst into the breakfast room, his tie askew and eyes wild with a combination of panic and something more difficult to name. "They've gone," he gasped. "The ledgers, Edivane's ledgers from the foundation, they're missing from the safe." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Which is safe?" "In the study. I kept the duplicate set there for cross-referencing. I checked them only 2 days ago, and now empty." Imogen stood, eyes sharp now. "Is the safe forced?" Turn shook his head, breathless. "No sign of tampering. The key was in the drawer where I always keep it." Poirot rose smoothly. "Take me there, monsieur." Within moments they were in the study, a high-ceilinged room lined with green damask wallpaper and filled with neat shelves of law books and dusty busts. The safe in question sat low in the wall behind a panel well concealed, but not unknown to those familiar with the house. Poirot examined the lock, opened the door, and peered into the dark interior. Indeed, empty, except he retrieved a folded scrap of cream paper that had been wedged in the back corner. It bore only 3 words, written in sharp, unlovely print: "Too late. Turn, chalk white. This is absurd," he muttered. "Someone's playing games. Those ledgers are confidential. They contain all financial records of the endowment for the past 10 years, including authorizations, transactions, and beneficiary notes." Poirot folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "And would they, perchance, include anything that might embarrass the Marchand name?" I don't know. Edivane managed the records. I reviewed them only periodically. He had full authority. Convenient, murmured Poirot. And now he is dead. And the records are gone. Turn swallowed. Are you accusing me, Monsieur Poirot? I accuse no one. I merely note the timing. They returned to the drawing room, where the others had begun to assemble. Drawn by the tremors of morning commotion, Dr. Bouchard arrived freshly shaven, followed by Benedict still half-dressed in a painter's shirt and slacks, and finally Lady Eugenia, her face stern and unmoved. The ledgers, Poirot announced quietly, are missing. A murmur spread through the group. Lady Eugenia's eyes narrowed. Stolen. When? Likely during the night, Poirot replied. But perhaps not by someone from outside. You mean one of us? Benedict said with a half-scoff. Poirot gave a small, non-committal shrug. The study is locked, but the key was accessible. No signs of break-in. Yet, curiously, no one claims to have seen or heard anything unusual. Perhaps that's because nothing was unusual, Imogen said. The thief was careful, or familiar with the house. Poirot turned to her. And you, mademoiselle? Did you retire early last night? I did not, she replied coolly. I was in the conservatory until nearly midnight. Sketching. Alone? Entirely. I enjoy silence, Monsieur Poirot. Something I suspect is foreign to you. Poirot smiled faintly. On the contrary, I find silence revealing. He turned toward Dr. Bouchard. And you, monsieur? I was in my room, reading. I heard footsteps around midnight, but assumed it was one of the servants. Footsteps going where? He hesitated. Downstairs. Light ones. Not hurried. Not stealthy. Poirot's eyes flicked to Lady Eugenia. And you, madam? I sleep lightly. I heard nothing unusual, and I certainly did not prowl about the house looking for dusty ledgers. Benedict gave a sharp laugh. Unless those ledgers held secrets you didn't want shared, mother. Lady Eugenia turned to him with an icy stare. You've always been good at deflection, Benedict, but eventually it wears thin. Poirot raised a hand. Please, let us not descend into suspicion without foundation. But in truth, he was already descending into layers of deception that had begun to crack. Someone had known those ledgers contained more than numbers. Someone had waited for George Edivane to die before striking. And someone had left a note not of confession, but of taunt. Too late. But for Poirot it was never too late. Chapter 7, The Psychological Meet, was shortly after noon when Poirot requested that the household refrain from leaving Marchand Hall. Though he couched the instruction politely, there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. Inspector Flint, having returned that morning from a preliminary report at headquarters, agreed to maintain a quiet watch on the grounds. Poirot had made it clear the truth now lived among them. All that remained was to coax it into the open. The detective chose the sunroom as his arena bright, spacious, and utterly without pretense. It lacked the austere drama of the library or the hushed intensity of the study. Instead, it offered something far more useful: clarity. Poirot arranged the room deliberately. He placed 6 chairs in a crescent, their backs to the glass windows overlooking the garden. He sat facing them, centered like the conductor of a symphony awaiting discord. On a small table beside him lay a notebook, closed, and a silver watch, ticking softly at precisely 1 o'clock. He summoned the entire party. They arrived one by one, Lady Eugenia in her impeccable navy silk, Dr. Bouchard with his habitual detachment, Benedict in a paint-streaked cardigan, Imogen carrying a sketchbook, and finally, a visibly weary Mr. Turn, the absence of George Edivane, once the magnetic center of this strange constellation, was now starkly felt. I thank you for your attendance, Poirot began, rising. You may wonder at the formality, but I believe a confrontation with the truth must have structure. He gestured to the semicircle of chairs. "Please, sit." They obeyed, wary but intrigued. Poirot remained standing. "Murder," he said softly, "is a most deliberate thing. Even in passion, it carries planning, risk, and fear. Yet what fascinates me most is not the act, but what follows it, the scramble to justify, to conceal, to rationalize. It is, as the doctor here would agree, psychological theater." Dr. Bouchard gave a non-committal nod. Poirot continued, "This murder, the murder of George Edivane, is unusual. No signs of struggle, no witnesses. A body found collapsed beside a bench that had long remained undisturbed. But Monsieur Edivane was not merely dead, he was silenced. There was a rustle among the group." Poirot's eyes flicked toward Turn. "Monsieur Turn, you claim the ledgers are gone, yet you did not report their disappearance until this morning." "Why?" Turn flushed. "Because I did not check the safe until then." Poirot tilted his head. "But you argued with George Edivane over the content of those very ledgers. Surely, when he died, you would have sought to confirm whether any damage had been done." Turn hesitated. "Yes, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of what I might find," he admitted. "That Roland's name had been tied to something unsavory. I feared scandal." Poirot gave a slight nod. "And so, you waited. That is understandable. But let us now suppose, Ms. Amos, that someone did search the safe last night, someone who feared what George had hidden, someone who believed that knowledge could ruin them." He let the silence stretch. "Lady Eugenia." All eyes turned toward her. "You knew Roland Marchand better than any of us," Poirot said gently. "Better, perhaps, than even your late husband. Were you aware of any arrangement between Roland and George?" She sat perfectly still. "Roland trusted George. That much I knew. But what George did with that trust I do not know. Not even when your own name appears in the Foundation's endowment files." Her expression barely shifted. "I was one of many beneficiaries. It was ceremonial." Poirot watched her for a beat longer, then turned his gaze to Imogen. "Mademoiselle Vale, you, too, are connected to Roland's past. Your sketches, your portrait series, you painted him often. You knew the man behind the philanthropist." "I knew the image he wanted to project," she replied. "The benevolent patriarch. But every portrait I painted of him came out blurred, somehow. Something always evaded the brush." Poirot nodded. "And what of last night? Were you truly alone?" "Yes," she said. "But I did leave the conservatory briefly. Around midnight, I returned a paintbrush to my case in the drawing room." "A paintbrush," Poirot repeated. "And did you see anyone?" "No. Or hear anything." She hesitated. "Only a cough somewhere near the west corridor. But I assumed it was one of the staff." Poirot registered this with a faint smile. "Even a cough may be telling." He stepped back. "Each of you has something to protect, be it reputation, memory, or opportunity. And someone among you believed George Edivane threatened that protection." He paused. "And someone," he said softly, "left a note. Too late. Turn." There was a visible ripple through the group. Poirot let the silence return, then added, "This note was not for George. It was a message to the living left by someone confident the game had already been won." Dr. Bouchard leaned forward. "Then what do you intend to do?" Poirot gave a slight bow. "I intend, Doctor, to examine the Carve-Oak bench more thoroughly. I believe George Edivane found something there before he died, something vital. And though his killer may believe it is gone, Hercule Poirot still has faith in the secrets of wood and dust." He turned to the group. "You are free to return to your activities, but I advise caution. The mind, when pressed by guilt, often betrays the body." With that, he departed, leaving 5 suspects and the growing weight of a secret just beyond reach. Chapter 8. A whisper from the wood terrace was quiet again, empty of guests and echoes. The Carve-Oak bench sat bathed in late afternoon light. Its once imposing structure now fractured by the splinter Poirot had so carefully preserved. But it was not the broken wood that interested him now, it was the whisper beneath it. Poirot arrived with precision. Inspector Flint trailed him reluctantly, a notebook in hand, skepticism etched across his face. "You've already scoured that bench 3 times, Flint muttered. "You won't find a murder weapon tucked under the legs." Poirot did not respond. Instead, he knelt beside the bench, took out a small magnifying glass, and inspected the base with intense concentration. "None," he murmured. "Not a weapon. A clue perhaps." His fingers tapped against the wooden crossbeam beneath the seat. There was something faint, nearly imperceptible, a tiny strip of adhesive. Not fresh, but not old either. He scraped it gently with a blade. "Tape," he said softly. "Something was once affixed here. A folded paper, maybe. A label." Flint frowned. "That proves nothing, but it confirms," Poirot said, standing slowly, "that something was removed hastily, and recently." He pointed to the scratch marks beneath the bench's seat. "Observe, this was pried out, not with a key, with fingers, raggedly." "Could be anyone," said Flint. "Just so," Poirot agreed. "And yet what if the key lies not in who opened the bench, but who knew it could be opened?" Flint raised an eyebrow. "The bench has been here for 40 years. "Precisely," said Poirot. "Yet of all those who have sat here, only 1 or perhaps 2 knew that a compartment existed. And George Edivane came here last night, not by chance, but with purpose. That compartment was no longer secret to him." He walked slowly to the balustrade. The view from here was vast, but it wasn't the horizon he studied, it was the approach. A person approaching from the left side of the terrace would be visible long before they arrived. From the right, however, the curve of the old hedge obscured the steps until the very last moment. Poirot turned to Flint. It was someone from inside the house. Someone who could approach quietly. Flint shook his head. "No footprints. Nothing disturbed." Poirot smiled faintly. "The mind that murders with calculation also walks with care." A sharp knock sounded from the direction of the drawing-room doors. Poirot turned. It was Benedict, his face taut. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something you should see." Poirot followed him swiftly through the hallways, Flint trailing. They turned left at the corridor near the library and arrived at a half-open door. Poirot hadn't previously noticed. This was George's temporary quarters, Benedict explained. After his row with Mr. Turn last week, he asked to be moved out of the guest wing. "I only remembered just now." The room was small but tidy, with a narrow desk and a travel trunk at the foot of the bed. The curtains were drawn halfway, and dust motes spun in the filtered sunlight. "What is it you found?" Poirot asked. Benedict led him to the desk. Inside this drawer, Poirot opened it. There, pushed to the back, was a small leather-bound notebook. A red ribbon marked the center, with delicate hands. Poirot lifted it out and opened to the marked page a list, carefully written and numbered. R.M. Funds Divertiginia. Beneficiary. Knowledge. Turn, complicit or blind. IV. Found sketch bouchered. New before 98. Testament. Where is the final copy? Poirot's brow furrowed. Mon Dieu. He flipped the pages. Most were coded, but interspersed with scrawled thoughts, erratic underlining, and names repeated names. The last page held only a single line. "If anything happens to me, the truth is hidden in the sketch." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "The sketch," he whispered. "Imogen." Benedict looked over his shoulder. "A sketch of what?" "That," Poirot said, closing the notebook, "is what I must discover. But it seems George Edivane was closer to a revelation than I suspected." He turned to Flint. "Guard this notebook. Have it photographed. And alert no one else." "Not yet," Flint nodded. "You think the sketch is still here?" "I think," Poirot replied, "that the answer lies with Mademoiselle Vale's art." As he exited the room, he passed the tall hallway mirror. His reflection gazed back at him, solemn, composed, but underneath alert. A murder always begins with silence, but it ends, invariably, with a voice sometimes hidden in wood, sometimes in paper, and now, perhaps, in paint. Chapter 9. The canvas remembers the late afternoon light filtered through the conservatories. Glass ceiling in warm, golden bars, casting flickering shadows over the ferns and ivy that hung in neat baskets overhead. In the far corner, seated before an easel with deliberate poise, Imogen Vale was painting. She wore a smock splattered with muted oils, her red hair pinned haphazardly at the nape of her neck. Her hand moved slowly across the canvas, dabbing shadow into a stone archway. She didn't look up when Poirot entered. "I thought you'd come," she said calmly. Poirot paused, surveying the scene. "Mademoiselle, you are clairvoyant." "No," she said, still not turning. "Just practiced. Every time something's discovered, you appear within the hour. You're like a bloodhound, or a storm cloud. I take no offense, but perhaps you will ask a question?" "Only one," she asked, finally looking up. Her eyes were sharp. "You'll never manage with just one, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled and walked slowly toward her. "Then let me begin with this. What did you sketch the night George Edivane died?" Imogen hesitated, then reached to the side of the easel. She produced a portfolio and withdrew a large charcoal sketch, unframed and unfinished. It depicted the rooftop terrace but not in full. "I started with the bench," she said. "It has a fascinating form. The carving, the way it curves like it's guarding something. I only got halfway through before I gave up. Something felt wrong." Poirot took the sketch gently, holding it at arm's length. The angle was unusual. The bench was drawn slightly from the side, as though the artist had shifted unconsciously, focused not on beauty, but on tension. And there, in the hollow curve of the bench's leg, Imogen had shaded something peculiar. A darkened patch, nearly obscured. Poirot tapped it with a gloved finger. "What is this?" "I don't know," she said softly. "When I was sketching, I thought I saw something tucked underneath, but I dismissed it as a shadow, or imagination." "None, mademoiselle," Poirot said with certainty. "It was not my imagination." He looked again, tracing the light lines that radiated outward from the base of the bench, lines that resembled, no, mimicked, splinters. "Might I keep this?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but I'd like it returned." Poirot inclined his head. "You have my word." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "He knew something," she said quietly. "George, I saw it in him. He'd stopped drinking, started carrying that little notebook everywhere. He barely slept." Poirot turned. "Did he confide in you?" "No. He started to, but he always stopped just short, like he didn't trust himself to say it aloud. Whatever he found, it frightened him." Poirot nodded, grave. "And when he went to the terrace that night, he was not watching the stars, was he?" "No," Imogen said. "He was watching someone." Poirot bowed slightly. "Merci, mademoiselle." He left the conservatory with the sketch tucked neatly beneath his arm and the sharp scent of turpentine still clinging to the air. Outside, the wind had picked up, tossing the ivy vines along the outer wall like restless fingers. Back in his room, Poirot spread the sketch across his desk. He studied every line, the curvature of the bench, the overgrown roses nearby, the sharp blackened section beneath the woodwork. He retrieved the tiny splinter he'd taken from the bench earlier and laid it beside the drawing. They matched. The splinter's jagged edge mirrored a break shown in Imogen's sketch, proof that whatever had been concealed there was removed after she drew it. Poirot turned next to Edivane's notebook. He flipped to the final page again. "The truth is hidden in the sketch." His eyes narrowed. Not a sketch, the sketch. A slow thrill curled down Poirot's spine. He reached for a magnifying glass and examined the lower right corner of the drawing. There etched faintly was a second shape, barely discernible beneath the heavy charcoal. Not part of the terrace, not part of the bench, a square. No, a rectangle, a folded paper. Poirot whispered, "A will." He stood abruptly and turned to the hallway, voice sharp. "Inspector Flint." Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Flint appeared, breathless. "What is it now?" Poirot held up the sketch. "I require everyone in the drawing room, at once. Lady Eugenia, Mr. Turn, Dr. Bouchard, Benedict, Mademoiselle Vale, no exceptions." Flint blinked. "What for?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "Because, mon ami, the time has come. The shadows are fading. The canvas remembers, and now so must they." Chapter 10. Gathering Storm's drawing room had changed. Not in furniture or fabric, the damask curtains still hung stiffly by the tall windows. The clock on the mantel still ticked in its patient, even rhythm. But the atmosphere had thickened. The warmth of summer now pressed in from every corner, and with it tension. Tight-lipped and wary, the household gathered under Poirot's request, each taking their seat as though entering a tribunal. Lady Eugenia perched on the edge of the settee, spine ramrod straight, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles Turn stood near the fireplace, a brandy untouched in his hand, his gaze shifting from Poirot to Flint and back again. Dr. Bouchard lingered in the doorway, his arms crossed, an expression unreadable, while Benedict chose a discreet corner near the sideboard, eyes flickering with unease. Imogen arrived last, sketchpad in hand, and seated herself without a word. Poirot stepped into the center of the room with the authority of a magistrate. He placed the sketch, now mounted on a stiff board, on a side easel brought in by Benedict. "I thank you all for coming," Poirot began, his voice as calm and precise as ever. "I ask only for your patience and your honesty." No one replied. Poirot gestured toward the easel. Mademoiselle Vale's drawing, made the evening of George Edivain's death, contains something remarkable, a detail unnoticed at first, but now, viewed in light of other clues, it speaks volumes. He stepped closer to the easel and tapped the shaded portion beneath the bench. Here, a folded shape, mostly erased whether by accident or intention, I do not know, but it matches perfectly the dimensions of what might be a concealed document. A paper, a letter, perhaps. He turned to the group. "A final testament." Lady Eugenia flinched. Charles Turn scowled. "This is nonsense. George had no authority over the estate. His mother died without amending the will. Everything passed to Lady Eugenia. That is the law." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, la loi, yes, but even the law must bow before a newer document. If one exists." Flint leaned forward, catching the scent of something rising. "You believe George found a second will?" Poirot nodded. "I do. And I believe he came to the terrace that night to retrieve it, likely intending to confront someone with its contents. But instead of a confrontation, there was silence, permanent silence. He allowed the words to linger. Dr. Bouchard finally broke it. "Assuming such a will existed, where is it now?" "That," Poirot said softly, "is what someone here must explain." Eugenia stood, suddenly. "This is absurd. I have administered this estate faithfully since Margaret's passing. I have devoted my life to this house, this family. My cousin George was a reckless, petty man with a fondness for gambling and sentiment. He wouldn't have known the first thing about legal documents. And yet," Poirot said, "he did know about the bench." She froze. "The compartment," Poirot continued, "the one only those familiar with the original craftsman's design could possibly suspect. George was not clever enough to notice it on his own. Someone told him." Poirot stepped toward her, gently but firmly. "Did you?" Her eyes narrowed. "Why would I? That bench was Margaret's pride, a sentimental piece. It's worthless, not to George," Poirot replied, "and not to someone who wanted a certain document to vanish." She opened her mouth, But it was Charles' turn, who interrupted her. "This is a witch hunt, Poirot. You have no proof that anything was ever hidden there. You're chasing ghosts." Poirot's voice dropped. "Ghosts, perhaps, but even they leave footprints." He turned away from them all, returning to the easel. He held up the notebook, George Edivane's journal. In this book, George recorded names, questions, suspicions, but also hope. His final entry suggests he believed the truth would be recognized through this very sketch. He entrusted it to memory, to observation. Poirot now addressed them all. What if that document was a revised will, one that revoked the earlier version? And what if someone among you knew it would undo all that had been gained by marriage, by favor, or by inheritance? Tension crackled in the silence. Poirot continued, his voice almost gentle. And so it was taken, removed from its hiding place beneath the bench. But not before someone else had seen it. Not before George could act. Lady Eugenia's voice was brittle. "And you accuse whom, Monsieur Poirot? Me, Charles, Imogen, Benedict." Poirot's gaze scanned the room. "I do not accuse, I observe. But now, I believe, the time for observing is nearly at an end." He turned to Flint. "We must search the study again, thoroughly, behind books, in drawers, beneath floorboards if needed. This house has many secrets, but secrets resist silence only for so long." He folded the notebook and sketched gently under his arm. "Tomorrow morning, I will ask one final question, and then, Ms. Amos, the truth will rise." The room sat in uneasy silence as he departed, the ticking of the clock loud in his wake. Outside, thunder murmured on the horizon. The storm, it seemed, had not yet begun, but it was coming. Chapter 11. Echoes in the studded corridors of Hartwood House had turned quiet, unusually so. The echo of Poirot's polished shoes sounded like whispers of judgment, as he and Inspector Flint returned to the grand old study, the place where so many threads of the past now converged. The rain had begun to fall in thin, hissing streams against the leaded windows, and each clap of distant thunder felt like punctuation to a sentence no one dared finish. Flint crossed the threshold first, flicking on the light switch. The room, panelled in centuries-old oak, glowed in deep browns and warm amber. It was a room built for secrets, high bookshelves, a fireplace so broad one could almost step inside, and the great roll-top desk that stood like a sentry in the middle of it all. Poirot ran a gloved finger along the edge of the desk, eyes sharp behind their glinting lenses. "This room has already been searched," Flint reminded him, his tone neutral but laced with fatigue. "Twice, if not more." Poirot nodded. "We, but always in haste, always for the obvious, and always without asking what George himself may have seen or suspected." Flint leaned against the edge of the hearth. "So what are we looking for now?" "A ghost," Poirot said, smiling faintly. "Not of a person but of a paper. Something once present and now absent." He opened the roll-top slowly. The desk was organized in a way that suggested George had tried, belatedly, to impose order on his cluttered mind. Stationery stacked neatly, pens aligned, a sheaf of typed letters pinned with a clip. Yet it all felt too curated, too recent. Poirot began to methodically empty each drawer. He moved with careful rhythm, lifting, observing, replacing. Twice he paused to inspect something closely, a smudge, a crease, but found nothing yet that rang true. Flint, meanwhile, turned his attention to the bookshelves. Many volumes bore George's initials, but some were far older. He pulled a few out at random, flipping through pages for any sign of tampering. After nearly 20 minutes, Poirot stepped back from the desk and turned his attention to the fireplace. "There's something about symmetry, mon ami," he said. The bench in the garden had a mirrored hiding place, a cavity no one noticed. Might the same principle apply here? Flint straightened. "You think there's a concealed compartment?" Poirot knelt beside the left panel of the fireplace. His fingers traced the panel's edge, pressing gently, testing, nothing. He moved to the opposite side and did the same. At first again, nothing. Then his brow furrowed. One side is fractionally looser than the other. With a small flick of his thumbnail, he located a hidden groove. A gentle press and with a faint click, the panel popped forward slightly. Flint inhaled sharply. "Well, I'll be." Poirot pulled the panel free. Inside the narrow cavity was a bundle wrapped in oilskin. Carefully, he drew it out and placed it on the desk. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside were two items. The first, a faded envelope bearing the seal of the late Lady Margaret Edivane. The second, a single sheet of parchment, creased but legible, dated 3 weeks before her death. Flint peered over his shoulder, eyebrows raised. "Is that what I think it is?" Poirot read the signature at the bottom and nodded gravely. "It is, a codicil to her will. One which overrides the earlier document in favor of a different heir. And the heir is?" Poirot placed the paper back down, pressing it flat. "Not Lady Eugenia, nor Charles, not even George." He glanced at Flint. "But I will reveal the name tomorrow when everyone is present. And then, I think, we will understand why a man died on a summer evening beneath the stars." Flint exhaled and folded his arms. "You think the killer suspected this document existed?" Poirot's gaze moved to the dancing firelight. "I believe they knew. And when George came to retrieve it, perhaps to protect it, perhaps to use it, someone made sure he would never speak again." There was a long silence. Poirot stepped back, folding the oilskin carefully again. "Bring everyone to the drawing room tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock sharp. It is time for the little gray cells to deliver their final truth." Flint looked at him curiously. "And this codicil, are you certain it hasn't already been seen by others in this house?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I am quite certain it has. And that, mon ami, is how I know who the killer is." Chapter 12. The drawing room reckoning at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning. The drawing room at Heartwood House filled with an air of brittle expectation. The rain had ceased, leaving the windows pearled with mist. A fire crackled in the grate, casting long shadows over the Persian rug, and the somber faces gathered around. Lady Eugenia sat upright, her hands resting like brittle twigs atop her lap. Her expression was polished to its usual hauteur, but beneath it lay a current of unease. Charles Edivane stood beside the sideboard, a tumbler of whiskey untouched in his hand. Lucinda hovered by the window, her fingers twisting the pendant at her throat, while Hugo paced silently near the bookcases. As if the words there might still offer answers, Poirot, as ever immaculate, stood by the mantel, his back to the fire, a folded parchment on the table before him. Flint took his place just to Poirot's left. His eyes scanned the room, alert for the slightest shift in breath or glance. Poirot began softly. "Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for joining me. It is never pleasant to gather in such circumstances, but as you know, a great wrong has been done, one that cost the life of your cousin, George Edivane." Lucinda flinched at the name. Charles shifted his weight. Poirot gestured to the desk. "Last night, concealed within a hidden compartment by the fireplace in the study, I discovered this." He lifted the folded parchment, a codicil dated 3 weeks before the death of Lady Margaret Edivane, and signed in her hand. Lady Eugenia stirred at that, but said nothing. "This codicil," Poirot continued, "amends her original will. It revokes all previous provisions, and instead names as sole heir to Heartwood House and its estate, Miss Lucinda Gray." A collective gasp broke the silence. Lucinda's hand fell to her side, stunned. Her eyes darted to Charles, then Lady Eugenia, then back to Poirot. "That's preposterous," Eugenia said sharply. "Margaret would never, but she did," Poirot said evenly. "This is her hand. The ink, the parchment, the seal, all authentic. More importantly, George knew of it. He had reason to believe it had been hidden." That is why he came to Heartwood House that evening. He was trying to blackmail someone, Hugo said. His voice low. Poirot turned toward him. Perhaps, but not in the sense you imagine. He had uncovered something, or suspected enough to begin asking questions. He was clever, our Monsieur George. He made copies of old correspondence, dug into estate papers, and I believe, even overheard conversations not meant for his ears. Charles finally spoke, his voice tight. Are you suggesting one of us killed him to protect an inheritance? I am suggesting, said Poirot, that George died because he had become inconvenient. Someone feared what he might reveal. Someone who already knew about this codicil because they had discovered it before him. Lucinda shook her head, dazed. But I had no idea. None. I never spoke to Lady Margaret alone. We barely knew each other. Poirot inclined his head. And yet, she had been watching you. Lady Margaret had become disillusioned with her own children. She found in you a gentleness, a conscience. It was not sentimentality she saw in you, someone who might care for this house, not just claim it. Lady Eugenia's voice was icy. And what would a poor relative know of managing an estate like Heartwood? Perhaps nothing, Poirot said softly. But she will learn, unlike those who already assume it is theirs. He turned to the others, his gaze narrowing. But here is the crux, Ms. Amos. Only one person knew both the location of the codicil and George's intentions. Only one person had the motive to prevent its discovery and the means to lure George to the rooftop terrace using an old family signal known only to a few. Who? Lucinda whispered. Poirot picked up the parchment. Let me tell you what I believe happened. There was a pause, deep and silent, before he spoke again, his voice calm but resolute. George was called to the rooftop terrace that evening by a short and urgent person. He expected a confrontation. He carried with him a copy of an old letter ammunition, perhaps, in his mind. But he did not expect betrayal. He did not expect the push. Poirot's eyes found the culprit. And now, at last, the truth will speak for itself. There was a collective breath held across the room. Faces turned toward the accused, but Poirot held the final name, still unspoken, just beyond reach. I will give the murderer one chance, he said quietly, to come forward now before I say the name aloud. The fire crackled. Rain began again, soft against the windows. No one moved. Poirot nodded slowly. Very well. Then I shall speak. Chapter 13. Shadows cast in fire-lithe drawing room remained frozen in a charged hush. Each guessed a tableau of tension beneath the carved cornices and flickering firelight. Hercule Poirot's dark eyes swept the room, pausing at each face, not merely observing, but measuring. I have always believed, he said quietly, that murder is rarely a moment of impulse. It is, more often, a crescendo, a decision born of fear, of desperation, and of vanity. He stepped slowly away from the hearth, his polished shoes making the faintest creak on the wooden floor. When George Edivane returned to Heartwood House that night, it was not to demand money, but to claim knowledge. He knew someone had discovered Lady Margaret's final wishes before he had. The codicil had not merely gone missing. It had been intentionally concealed. Charles exhaled sharply. Then why didn't he go to a solicitor? To the authorities? Because, Poirot answered, he needed more proof. And perhaps he thought he could handle it himself, use it to leverage some position for himself. He was careless. He told the wrong person what he knew. And for that, he died. Lucinda's voice trembled. But why kill him? If they already had the codicil, couldn't they simply destroy it? Poirot nodded gravely. Ah, mademoiselle, you have said it exactly. They could have destroyed it, but they did not. Why? Because they couldn't. Because George already knew where it was hidden, or was very close to finding out. Once he had it in his hands, it would have been too late. He turned now to Lady Eugenia, whose face had gone pale. You are unusually quiet, madam. I have nothing to say to this performance, she said icily. You accuse us with innuendo and parlor games, perhaps, Poirot said, not unkindly. But indulge me once more. He turned his gaze to Hugo. You were the last to see George alive. No. You said you passed him in the corridor, returning from the rooftop terrace? Hugo gave a tight nod. Yes, I was going upstairs to retrieve a book I'd left in the library. And you did not notice anything unusual in his manner? He looked tense, determined, maybe. But George always had a way of appearing as though he was plotting something. Poirot paced, hands behind his back, and yet, there was no library book retrieved, was there? I searched your room, Monsieur Hugo. There were no books there from that floor. In fact, I believe you never went to the library at all. Hugo's jaw clenched. Are you accusing me now? I accuse no one yet, but I observe. You see, your alibi, while charmingly vague, is not confirmed by any other witness. And there's something else. Poirot approached the fireplace again and drew from his coat pocket a small, folded silk glove. This was found wedged behind the stone balustrade on the rooftop terrace, hidden, but not lost. Lucinda gasped. That's mine. No, Poirot said softly, holding it up. It is not yours, mademoiselle. Yours are ivory silk. This is pale gray and it bears a faint monogram. He turned the glove inside out. The initials EAE. Lady Eugenia made a strangled sound. Poirot's tone was suddenly sharp, relentless. You followed George to the rooftop, did you not, madam? You had discovered the codicil days before. You knew what it meant for your family, for your future. Your daughter-in-law, Lucinda, the poor relation named heir over your son? It was unthinkable. He stepped toward her, voice dropping. So you hid the document. You told no one. And when George got too close to the truth, when he confronted you, you panicked. You did not mean to kill him, I suspect. But when he threatened to reveal what he knew, you acted. Lady Eugenia looked around. Lips parted. I did what I had to do. Lucinda gasped. You admit it? I protected this family, Lady Eugenia said, rising to her feet now, her voice thin and brittle. I protected our name, my son's inheritance. Do you think Margaret knew what she was doing? She was unwell, confused. Poirot's face was unreadable. She was not confused. She made a choice. Lady Eugenia's voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to end like that. George wouldn't listen. He laughed. He mocked me. I only meant to frighten him. But he lost his balance. Yet you left him there, Poirot said gently, and said nothing. You let your family believe it was suicide. She turned away from them all, as if even now, she could retreat into denial. Lady Eugenia Edivane. Flint stepped forward quietly. I must ask you to accompany me. You are under arrest for the murder of George Edivane. There was no further protest. Only silence, broken by the soft rustle of fabric as she allowed herself to be led away. When the door finally closed behind them, it was Lucinda who spoke first. I don't want Hartwood House. Poirot smiled faintly. But it wants you, mademoiselle. It has been waiting. Chapter 14. The legacy of Silenceath. Morning after the confession was bleak and overcast, casting Hartwood House in a cold, leaden hue. The estate so long suspended in whispered suspicion and aging grandeur now felt strangely hollow, as though the very walls mourned the unraveling of secrets too long kept. Poirot sat in the solarium, sipping his coffee in silence. Outside, the trees swayed listlessly, their leaves barely rustling. Across from him, Lucinda hovered by the tall windows, arms folded across her chest, eyes lost in the misty garden beyond. It's difficult to believe, she said after a long pause. Lady Eugenia, always so composed, so commanding, to think she would murder? Poirot interjected gently. Or deceive. Perhaps, mademoiselle, it is not so surprising. Those who wear their pride as armor often fear loss most deeply. Lucinda turned, her voice low. I feel as if everything I understood about this family, about myself, has crumbled. I thought I was unwanted, a footnote. But Aunt Margaret, she named me as heir. Why? Poirot set down his cup and leaned forward. It is precisely the question you must ask, is it not? She sank into the chair across from him. I hardly knew her. She kept to herself. I didn't think she even liked me. Ah, Poirot smiled faintly. But that is where the English reserve conceals too much. Madame Margaret was a woman of observation, of careful deliberation. She saw, perhaps, what others overlooked. A soft knock interrupted them. Inspector Flint entered, his face tired but respectful. Pardon the intrusion, but I thought you should both know Lady Eugenia has been taken into custody. No protest, no statement. Poirot nodded. She will say little. Her pride remains intact, if nothing else. There's more, Flint added, stepping closer. We found the codicil. It was concealed behind a false panel in the escritoire in the drawing room. Just as you suspected, Poirot. Bon, Poirot said softly, folding his hands. And it confirms what we know. Flint nodded. Miss Lucinda Edivane, heir to the Hartwood estate and its holdings, with explicit mention of her character, her integrity, and her compassion. Lucinda's mouth opened slightly. She did see me. Poirot stood and moved toward the window. Yes, mademoiselle. She saw in you the future, not merely of property, but of dignity. The house, for all its decay, is still a legacy. She entrusted it to the one who would treat it as more than stone and timber. There was a long silence. Flint excused himself with a courteous nod, and Lucinda sat motionless, absorbing the shift in her life that had unfolded so abruptly. Finally, she spoke. What happens now? Poirot turned from the window, his gaze softening. Now, mademoiselle, you must decide what you will do with Hartwood. Restore it, sell it, let it rest. That is not for me to say. But I advise you to consider this. You were chosen not for your blood, but for your spirit. Do not let bitterness guide your path forward. She looked down. I never wanted any of this. None, Poirot said gently. But you have it, and perhaps, in time, it will come to feel not like a burden but a gift. There was a pause, and then Lucinda glanced toward him with a faint smile. You're quite good at this, Monsieur Poirot. Merci, mademoiselle. It is my profession to make sense of the tangled threads others ignore. But even I cannot tidy every emotion, every grief. That Tabine is the work of time. He made to leave, then turned back with a last thought. There is one more question, is there not? One I must ask. Lucinda blinked. Yes, Poirot's voice lowered. Did you ever speak to George Edivane before his death? About the codicil? Lucinda hesitated. Her lips parted then closed. No, she said at last. I had no idea. I swear it. Poirot studied her face for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Tresbine, he said softly. Then let us leave it at that. Outside, the sun finally breached the clouds, casting pale gold across the overgrown hedges and the dew-laced stones of the garden path. Somewhere within Hartwood's walls, dusk continued to settle, but for the first time in years, the silence did not feel oppressive. It felt like peace. Chapter 15. A garden for the dead garden had changed. Lucinda noticed it on the third morning after the arrest, as she wandered through the gravel paths alone, the autumn wind teasing loose petals from the last of the roses. Where once the hedges had bristled unkempt and the flower beds languished under a veil of indifference, now there was a subtle order returning, a suggestion of care, of a hand reaching once more toward restoration. She had instructed the groundskeeper, Mr. Havers, to begin tending it again. Start small, she had said. Let it breathe. Now, as she moved beneath the yellowing canopy of the hornbeams, her thoughts drifted to Margaret, her elusive great-aunt, whose legacy had only been understood after her death. The woman whose quiet rebellion had rewritten the fate of Heartwood with a stroke of ink on parchment, hidden behind a panel, and a silence deeper than any she had ever known. Lucinda stopped at the small wrought-iron bench at the garden's center. It faced a patch of overgrown ivy and thorny hedgerow, tangled together like secrets refusing to be pruned. Somewhere beyond, she knew, was the stone marker an old family plot for the Edivanes, seldom visited. A rustling behind her. "I thought I might find you here," said Poirot, his voice soft as he stepped down the path. "Mademoiselle, I do not mean to intrude." Lucinda shook her head. "You're not I. It's strange, but I find the garden more comforting now than the house, because the garden does not pretend," he replied, settling on the bench beside her. "It shows its decay, its resilience, the truth of its condition, none." She offered a half-smile. "I suppose that's one way to put it." Poirot looked out toward the tangled growth. "I spoke to the solicitor this morning. The paperwork is progressing smoothly. There will be no contesting of the codicil. Lady Eugenia, she has made her peace with the consequences. She'll be imprisoned," Lucinda said, the words hanging in the air like frost. Poirot inclined his head. "It is likely, but not for the reason you may think." Lucinda turned sharply to him. "What do you mean?" "She may not have killed Margaret Edivane, mademoiselle." Lucinda stared. "But the confession?" Poirot raised a hand. "Ah, yes. But remember, pride is a many-layered cloak. What Lady Eugenia confessed to was obstruction, anger, fear. She admitted to hiding the codicil, to bitter resentment. But I do not believe she administered the poison." Lucinda's breath caught. "Then, someone else. Margaret died of aconitine poisoning deliberately introduced." "Yes, but there remains no evidence that Eugenia ever touched the decanter. No fingerprints, no direct access at the key moment. The groundskeeper saw her leave before the bell rang, and the poison would have needed more time to act, more proximity." Lucinda stood, heart beating faster. "Then who?" Poirot looked up at her, gently. "Someone with access to the household's inner rhythm. Someone who could move between rooms unnoticed. Someone whose motive was not hatred but mercy." There was a long silence. Lucinda sat down again, very slowly. She was in pain, she whispered. Poirot did not answer, letting her memory surface what he already suspected she knew. She hated hospitals. She wouldn't let anyone care for her. The cancer was in her bones. That last week, she barely slept. Poirot's voice was low. "Do you remember the maid, Estelle? The one who disappeared the morning after Margaret died?" Lucinda blinked. "Estelle. She left. I thought she found other work. She did not. She returned home, quietly, without notice. It seems she had formed an unusual attachment to Miss Margaret. She saw the suffering, perhaps more than anyone else. The laudanum in the cabinet was hers." Lucinda's mouth parted in horror. "You think she—" Poirot shrugged slightly. "The motive may have been compassion, mademoiselle, or desperation. We may never know. But it was not Lady Eugenia's hand that delivered death. Only the silence afterward condemned her." Lucinda stared at the garden, her throat tight. "So many silences." Poirot stood. "And yet, you heard them. In time, you listened. That is more than most." She rose beside him. "Will you stay, Monsieur Poirot? A few more days? I must return to London, alas. There are matters that call me. But I leave Heartwood in good hands." Lucinda managed a faint smile. "You mean mine? We, yours." He offered a slight bow. "Tend to it, mademoiselle. Let it grow again. The truth, like the garden, will bloom with patience." As he walked away, his silhouette receding down the gravel path, Lucinda remained by the hedgerow, eyes fixed on the twisting green and thorn. Somewhere beyond, among old stone and forgotten soil, her great aunt rested not as a victim, Not even as a matriarch, but as a woman whose final act had been to choose hope over heritage. She took a breath and stepped forward, brushing the ivy aside. It was time to begin again. Chapter 16. A matter of Greycell's train to London cut swiftly through the countryside, a dull blur of hedgerows and fields outside the window. Inside the first-class compartment, Hercule Poirot sat with his back straight, hands folded precisely over the handle of his cane. He did not nap, nor gaze wistfully at the scenery. Instead, his eyes were half closed, his expression thoughtful, a man communing with silence, and more importantly, with his own thoughts. Across from him, Inspector Mountjoy leaned back with less composure. He had joined Poirot at the station on a last-minute summons. Though the detective had offered little explanation beyond, "There is a thread, mon ami, one we must not let slip through our fingers." Mountjoy watched Poirot for several long moments before speaking. "You believe the case at Hartwood Hall isn't finished?" "I do not believe, my friend," Poirot murmured. "I know." Mountjoy raised a brow. Lady Eugenia confessed. The codicil was hidden. The motive, the opportunity, all ticked off neatly. "Ah," Poirot said with faint amusement, "but the truth is rarely neat. It frays at the edges, like tapestry unraveling. Have you not seen how some confessions serve only to protect what lies beneath?" Mountjoy exhaled through his nose. "You're referring to Estelle, the maid. You still suspect her?" "I suspect the idea of Estelle. Let me explain." Poirot opened his eyes fully now, and the famous gleam of the little Greycells sharpened. "The girl vanished the morning after the death. Lady Eugenia made no mention of her, curious, n'est-ce pas? And Lucinda barely remembered her. Yet this Estelle was, by all accounts, unusually devoted to Margaret Edivane. She administered her medicine, perhaps even read to her. But she is a ghost in that house's memory. She left of her own accord," Mountjoy said, though he sounded less certain now. "Non, she was allowed to leave. That is quite different, and I ask myself who benefits from such a vanishing act." Mountjoy leaned forward slightly. "You think she was paid off?" Poirot tapped a finger lightly on the edge of his cane. "That is one possibility, but I lean toward something more subtle. Suppose the person who administered the poison had no desire for harm. Suppose she did so believing it was Margaret's wish, a mercy, not a murder. But why hide then?" Mountjoy asked. Poirot gave a faint smile. "Because, mon ami, the law is not so easily persuaded by compassion, and the one who orchestrated such a thing would know this. She would not risk exposure." Mountjoy frowned. "You're saying there was someone besides Estelle involved?" "I am saying," Poirot said carefully, "that Estelle may not have acted alone or at all. Perhaps her sudden disappearance was not flight, but removal." Mountjoy's eyes narrowed. "By Lady Eugenia?" Poirot shook his head. "No, Eugenia was too proud to indulge in backstairs scheming. She would have destroyed the will openly, not orchestrated some elaborate vanishing. No. The one who acted did so with quiet authority, someone who understood Margaret's suffering and had the means to arrange the exit of a servant without drawing suspicion." Mountjoy's brow furrowed. "Lucinda?" Poirot held up a finger. "Non, Mademoiselle Lucinda is many things, but she is not a deceiver. She has too much of her great-aunt in her, blunt, principled. But think, Mountjoy, who in that household would understand discretion, possess the trust of the dying woman, and yet remain in the shadows?" A long pause followed. "The housekeeper," Mountjoy said finally. "Mrs. Greaves," Poirot confirmed, with a satisfied nod. "She was with the family for over 2 decades. She oversaw the staff. She had access to the laudanum, and she likely knew Estelle intimately. It is my belief that when Margaret's illness became unbearable, a pact was made, not spoken aloud. No documents signed, just understanding between 2 women. Mountjoy absorbed this in silence. Poirot continued. "Mrs. Greaves was loyal to Margaret, not to the Edivanes. When the codicil was found, she must have seen her chance to protect what Margaret had chosen. But when Lady Eugenia turned hysterical, then she knew scandal was near. Estelle's disappearance was no doubt her doing, and she remained silent to preserve both Margaret's wishes and the fragile dignity of Heartwood. So what now? Montjoy asked. You'll confront her? Poirot smiled gently. No, mon ami, there is no need. The truth, it has emerged where it was needed. Lucinda inherits. Lady Eugenia faces justice, though not, I think, the gallows. And Mrs. Greaves, well, she has already borne the burden of her choice. That is punishment enough. The inspector looked skeptical. You're letting it go. I am not the law inspector. I am only the seeker of truth, and in this case, the truth is soaked in sorrow. There is little satisfaction in dragging the past into the courts. When the future is now free to grow, the train whistle sounded, shrill and distant. London drew nearer, yet the echoes of Heartwood lingered between them. Montjoy studied Poirot. Have you ever tired of all this? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Jamais. For where there are people, there are puzzles. And where there are puzzles there is always Poirot. They both fell into silence. The rattle of the train a steady rhythm beneath their thoughts. Outside, the countryside gave way to brick and smoke and skyline. The city loomed indifferent and immense, but in the carriage, one man sat content, his mind at ease until the next case called him forward. Chapter 17. Echoes in the fogged London mist curled thick around the street lamps of Clapham. As Poirot stepped lightly from the cab, the pavement was slick beneath his patent leather shoes, and the evening air carried a chill that tugged insistently at the collar of his overcoat. Beside him, Inspector Montjoy exhaled through gritted teeth, pulling his scarf tighter. Are you certain about this? Montjoy muttered, glancing up at the plain townhouse. We could have summoned her to Scotland Yard. Poirot raised a hand. None, my friend. One must not frighten the bird before it sings. He rang the bell. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Greaves, dressed plainly in gray. Her posture was ramrod straight, but her eyes were wary. She did not seem surprised to see them. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly, and Inspector Montjoy. I wondered when you might come. Poirot gave a slight bow. May we come in, madam? She stepped aside without a word. The house was modest but immaculately kept. Everything was in its place. The smell of lavender lingered in the corners, clean, controlled, unchanging. They seated themselves in the drawing room. Mrs. Greaves did not offer tea. Poirot leaned forward. I shall not waste time with pleasantries, madam. You were closer to Margaret Edivane than you admitted. You arranged for Estelle's disappearance, did you not? A flicker of emotion passed over her face. It wasn't fear but sorrow, carefully concealed. She was a frightened girl. Mrs. Greaves said after a pause. Too soft for what she'd been asked to do. Margaret trusted her. Trusted me, too. We promised to honor her wishes. You gave her the laudanum? Montjoy asked, his voice low. No, her voice did not waver. But I stood by and let it happen. Margaret had suffered enough. It was not murder, it was mercy. You can believe that or not, but it was the truth. Poirot's gaze was steady. And the codicil? She told me about it days before she passed. I warned her it would only bring bitterness. She said bitterness had already eaten her family. She wanted Lucinda to have a future. You protected her, Montjoy said, more softly now. And when Lady Eugenia broke, when she tried to destroy the codicil, you stayed silent. I did what I thought was right, Mrs. Greaves said. Margaret died with peace. Estelle disappeared with my help sent to relatives abroad. I paid for her passage. She was a child. She should not have had to live with that memory. Poirot nodded once. You carry a lot, madam, but it is not always a crime to be loyal. She met his eyes. Will you have me arrested? None, Poirot said. You are already imprisoned by your conscience. That is enough. They rose, and she walked then to the door. Outside, the fog had thickened. Poirot pulled on his gloves, glancing back once at the quiet house. A chapter had closed not neatly, but completely. He turned to Montjoy. "Come, my friend. The night is young, and just as she is satisfied." They vanished into the London mist. Chapter 18. The final toast. It was nearly midnight when the guests gathered once more. In the drawing-room of the Edivane residence, the chandelier above cast soft golden light over crystal glasses, and the scent of roses drifted from a fresh bouquet. The storm that had threatened all evening had passed, leaving the terrace damp and glistening. Lucinda stood near the hearth, a faint uncertainty clouding her face. Lady Eugenia, wrapped in silken silence, kept her distance near the window, her features composed but unreadable. Edward poured himself a third brandy with a steady hand. Miss Dalrymple, quiet and observant as ever, took her seat beside the piano. Poirot, poised as always, rose from his chair and addressed them all. "I have asked you here tonight, Mzamas, not to unveil a crime, no, that has already been done, but to explain it fully. For what is a mystery without understanding? A trick, a puzzle, but with understanding, it becomes justice." Lucinda looked up. "So it's true, then. My mother, the codicil." Poirot inclined his head gently. "Yes, mademoiselle. Your mother's final wish was that you inherit the estate. She believed your father had caused her nothing but sorrow, and that you, though not his child by blood, deserved a future of your own. Mrs. Greaves preserved that truth for years, until events forced her to act." Edward scoffed. "A fine tale, and we're all meant to believe the housekeeper played the heroine while the rest of us, what, slept?" Poirot turned to him. "You knew, monsieur. Not the details, perhaps, but enough to guess the codicil existed. That is why you called the solicitor the very day." Lady Eugenia fell ill, hoping to forestall its discovery. Edward's lips pressed thin. "Circumstantial, mais oui. But let us also consider Miss Dalrymple." Poirot smiled toward her. "You saw more than you let on, did you not? The night Estelle vanished." Miss Dalrymple straightened. "I did not know her name then. Only that Mrs. Greaves left in the dead of night with a bundle and returned alone. I suspected, but I told no one. Margaret had confided in me once. I knew she was afraid for her child." Poirot nodded. "And you, Lady Eugenia," his voice softened, "you destroyed the codicil not out of greed, but out of fear. You thought it an invention, perhaps a delusion in Margaret's last days." Lady Eugenia's eyes glittered, her voice trembling. "I had lost a daughter. My name, my dignity, the silence I built around that pain, I could not bear to see it unravel. The codicil would have made it public. I thought I was protecting her." "No," Poirot said gently. "You were protecting yourself." A long silence followed. The truth had arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet inevitability. Lucinda took a breath. "So what now? What becomes of us?" Poirot turned to her with a rare warmth in his eyes. "Now, mademoiselle, you live. With clarity, not shadows. The past is not undone, but it need not dictate the future." He raised his glass. "To Margaret Edivane, a woman of secrets and of sorrow, but also of courage." The others hesitated, then slowly followed suit. "To Margaret," Lucinda echoed. The glasses clinked. Poirot stepped out onto the terrace once more, the cool air brushing against his cheeks. From this height, the city stretched out beneath the stars, vast and unknowable. But tonight, at least one small mystery had been set to rest. Behind him, laughter tentative, real, floated from the drawing-room. Poirot smiled to himself and adjusted his cuffs. "A quiet case," he murmured, "but not without its little complications. As always, the human heart is the greatest mystery of all." And with that, Hercule Poirot descended the steps into the night, his silhouette disappearing into the hush of London, where secrets, once buried, no longer whispered quite so loudly.